We have a problem in America with poor quality jobs. There's no reason why we should even have a class of people in America called the working poor. The kind of jobs we find in places like Walmart and McDonald's, the part-time minimum wage jobs with no benefits, they're a problem, and it's getting worse. Now, we think of Walmart as a cheap place to buy things, but it really isn't. A large majority of Walmart employees cost us several $1,000s per year in welfare benefits. Benefits that they really need because of the poor quality jobs they've got. Walmart would only have to raise its prices by less than 2 cents on the dollar to be able to pay a $10.50 minimum wage. Now, these jobs are going to continue to expand because anytime one business in an industry goes to minimum wage jobs, it puts pressure on every business in the same industry to adopt the same kinds of jobs. Now, if you think that education will get us out of this, you're probably mistaken. Take a look at university graduates in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. 3 years after graduation, between a fourth and half of them still have not found work in their chosen field. And if you think the labor surplus in that market has affected their wages and benefits, you're right. So what are we going to do about it? Well, I can think of 2 possible approaches. One involves the government. We could raise the minimum wage, but that would only be part of what we'd need to do. We'd also need to pass a law that said something like businesses that employ more than 10% of their workers part-time have to pay part-time benefits. That would remove the incentive for businesses to break up full-time jobs into part-time jobs so that they wouldn't have to pay those benefits. There's a second possibility. I almost hate to mention it because a lot of people in Georgia get really angry when they hear the U word. But if what I've said before has sometimes made sense to you, give me a break here and listen up for a minute. There's one thing about unions that might even have some appeal to hardcore conservatives. And that is that unions can solve the kinds of problems we're talking about without involving the government. Now, I understand the complaints about unions. What I hear most often is that they drive away jobs by making wages too high. I usually hear that complaint illustrated with the auto industry. But we used to be able to withstand those high-paying jobs. What happened? Well, I think the biggest problem is free trade agreements. Those will ship jobs overseas. But the wages themselves? I don't think so. Look, in Germany, auto workers are paid twice as much as American auto workers, and little Germany produces twice as many cars as the big United States. Every country I know of that has a higher standard of living than the United States, France, Germany, the Scandinavian countries, Holland, they all have very strong unions. Now, I also hear that unions are corrupt. Well, it was J. Edgar Hoover who convinced us that unions were corrupt, and given what we know now about J. Edgar Hoover, we might suspect he was exaggerating a little bit. But he did talk Congress into creating the National Labor Relations Board. Now, that's really nothing but a police force dedicated to policing unions. If you go on the internet and search for union corruption, you will undoubtedly wind up at a site that tells you that in the last 10 years, the NLRB has levied $640 million in labor racketeering fines. And if you go to the NLRB's site, you will find that's true. $640 million in 10 years for labor racketeering. But what is labor racketeering? Well, if you actually start reading the cases on the NLRB's website, you find out that unions aren't paying the fines. Companies are paying the fines. Unions are the victims. Companies do things like abuse pension funds. I also hear that, and I kind of get this, that if you own a business, you ought to be able to decide what the wages are going to be. And if somebody doesn't like your wages, they can go someplace else and get a job. But as a practical matter in the United States, there is always a labor surplus. And if you're trying to feed a family, you can't negotiate your wages that way. Now, we expect companies to negotiate every other input they have. We don't think that Walmart pays Sunbeam whatever Sunbeam wants for its mixers. Walmart negotiates that. And there's no reason why they shouldn't negotiate wage inputs as well. And finally, I often hear that unions used to be important but aren't anymore. Well, anybody who knows what working conditions were like at the start of the 20th century knows that unions were important then. And as long as unions were strong, working conditions kept getting better until the 1970s, when we destroyed the unions. Since then, working conditions have been getting worse. Now, if you listen a lot to Fox News, you will hear about how all that union money in politics is distorting politics. Well, just a second here. Every union in the United States put together spends less money on politics than the Koch brothers alone. Now, it doesn't matter to me very much whether voters want government to solve this problem or they want unions to solve this problem, whatever the voters want. But it's a problem we really need to solve, or everybody will be working for slave wages. Now, you may not like either of those solutions, but unless you've got another one, pick something you don't like.